This is Bishop Michael Burbidge, and you are listening to the Walk Humbly Podcast.
Welcome to the Walk Humbly Podcast. I'm Billy Atwell, Chief Communications Officer for the Diocese and your co-host. If you haven't already, please make sure you rate this podcast and write a review. We're on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Overcast, and more. You can sign up for our e-newsletter at arlingtondiocese.org, and you can follow Bishop Burbidge on Twitter. More than 15,600 of you already do, at Bishop Burbidge. You can also send questions at the end of these podcasts. Bishop Burbidge answers questions from the faithful. You can email us info@arlingtondiocese.org. That's info@arlingtondiocese.org. I welcome your host, Bishop Burbidge. Bishop, how you doing?
I'm doing well, Billy. Thank you so much. Good to have another podcast, and thanks to our listeners.
So you have literally been a world traveler as of late, visiting our seminarians. Talk a little bit about those trips, what you've been experiencing, who you've been talking to, that kind of thing.
Sure. It's one of the great joys as bishop and as is to have the pastoral visits with our seminarians at the seminaries where they're participating in the programs of priestly formation. The major seminaries that we use, which I have visited, is the North American College in Rome. We have 5 of our seminarians studying there. So what a great sacrifice, Billy, to have to give up time away from the office to go to Rome to visit them. So, and then also Mount St. Mary's Seminary and St. Charles Borromeo Seminary in Philadelphia. The 3 of them I have recently visited, and then I will visit some of our college seminarians at Pope John Paul II Seminary in Washington. They do their classes at the Catholic University of America. But I can say to all of our listeners, we have every reason to be filled with hope, great hope, as we look to the future of our church and, God willing, our future priests. I am very, very proud of our seminarians. We keep the standards very high in accepting a seminarian, and we have tremendous candidates who are devoted and are actively and fully participating in their programs of priestly formation. So, such a great joy. I'll be ordaining, God willing, 5 new priests this year too.
Wow, that's wonderful.
And thanks to our listeners, the Bishop's Lenten Appeal, one of the recipients of the Bishop's Lenten Appeal is the education and formation of our seminarians. So we are blessed to have 44 seminarians, 16 in application already for next year. And how could we give them such quality education and information without the generosity of our benefactors? So a word of thanks. And if I also could add, Billy, one of the questions I hear a great deal at this critical time in the life of our church is concern about seminaries.
Yeah.
We know that in the past, certainly some failures of formation programs have come to light. I can say with the utmost confidence that I have great trust in the priests, the wonderful priests and formators who are assigned to the seminaries that I just mentioned. These are excellent programs, and in I meet with every seminarian privately and individually, and they have concurred that they're very happy and very grateful for the quality formation they are receiving. So many thanks to all of you who make that possible. And I want to thank you for praying for our seminarians by name. And many of our schools and young people communicate with our seminarians, let them know they're praying for them. And I can tell you that goes a long way to encourage them. So thank you.
And you've spoken in the past about how seminary formation is so different than what it was when you were going through seminary, and that close relationship with your bishop, or in your case from Philadelphia, an archbishop. It wasn't necessarily there. You didn't have that close relationship. So when you talk about these personal, sit downs, with each man, what are the kinds of things that you discuss that you didn't get the opportunity to have when you were going through formation?
Right, and it's been a major shift in priestly formation that probably goes back maybe back to the early 90s, where it really became heightened awareness, responsibility that the bishop is the chief formator. The bishop is the chief formation director and vocation director. So he has to be directly involved and know these candidates that, God willing, he will ordain one day. And so really see, back probably in the 90s, the bishop becoming very much more involved in the life of the seminarians. And, our seminarians are very transparent. I always tell them that, you are discerning, but so is the church discerning.
Right.
And so you have to let the church know, who are you? And I commend our seminarians for their transparency. And probably one of the greatest shifts in the early 90s with John Paul II's famous document, Pastores Dabo Vobis, I will give you shepherds. He said that really what has to be a major focus in seminary formation, if not in addition to the spiritual, is the human formation. The human formation. How is this man growing in emotional maturity and his ability to embrace chaste, celibate living? How is he able to relate to all people, his peers, women, everyone? And so they have to become part of the discussion with the bishop and with the seminarian. So, of course, you will be talking about sensitive subjects that in the past may not have been addressed. And so those honest, those transparent conversations are so important.
I think parents could actually relate to this. As I'm hearing you talk about the bishop is the chief formator, my oldest child is about to go to school. And we're talking with the teachers and the principal, and we're having to understand we're still the principal teachers.
That's right.
And educators of our child, but we need some help with it. So we have to be involved and know what's going on and understand whatever formation is going to happen there. It sounds a lot. I'm just hearing the parallels. I've never thought of it this way until just this moment.
That's a great image. That's a great example. Parents are the first teachers of their children in ways of faith. The schools are only your partners.
Right.
Same thing with the bishop. He's the chief formator. Seminaries are only our partners in helping us with that task.
That's right. Very good. Bishop, this some rough news this week. The U.S. Senate voted on a bill known as the Born Alive Act, which would have required that children who survive an abortion be treated by the doctor as any other child who is outside of the womb. It would essentially have banned infanticide. Stunningly, it failed. 44 senators, including both Virginia senators, voted against this seemingly simple measure to defend children. You and Bishop Nestout responded to the outcome, saying that you were dismayed and astounded and called the failure appalling and beyond comprehension. Strong words there. You made your feelings clear. We're a few days out from it. What are you thinking now that we are kind of a few days from that and you made this statement?
Yeah, and I'm sure the words that Bishop Nestout and I used, appalling and beyond comprehension, dismayed, are sentiments that all of our listeners have. How can you not? It's just so tragic when you think about it, that infanticide is now a matter of public debate. Unbelievable. And if one senator, in my opinion, had voted against this bill, it would have been a national tragedy.
Yeah.
But 44,
it's remarkable.
It's unbelievable. It's so sad. And in Virginia, this is insult to injury because, as we know, our own governor just a few weeks ago indicated his support for infanticide during a radio interview. And so I would think that for most people listening, I don't need to explain why a baby should be treated as any other adult and given the right to life. That's given. That's a given. I hope and pray for all those who are listening. But I think, Billy, what we need to acknowledge is that there is an unhealthy shift, I think, in the national conversation. It was bad enough, and it's when a baby in the womb had no voice or rights. And it is bad enough. But now babies outside of the womb, whose cries can be heard, will be snuffed out. This is where we are in our nation. So what I think it is, it's a rallying cry for all Catholics, for all people of goodwill, and I see that happening.
Yeah.
As tragic as this is, it has awakened a lot of people that we can't be sitting still here. It's a rallying cry, and we must act, and so we must stand again and again for the unborn. The rights of the most vulnerable in our society must be protected. And so the failures, I think, what we have seen have not been among the faithful always or the general public. The failures we have seen are with elected officials who have the duty, the sacred duty, I tell them, to protect all of our citizens. But I don't want our listeners to think there's nothing we can do. and just to give into despair.
It is sufficiently depressing, I have to say.
It is sufficient. It is. It's very sad, and we all feel that. And that when you become aware of such tragedy in life, there is almost that first tendency of despair.
Yeah.
Like,
what does it take?
But we have power. And so that begins with getting on our knees in prayer. That's where it begins. And then we should carry that power to the voting booth and to vote for pro-life candidates. That's why it's so important as a faithful citizen. We're not only called to be a citizen, we're supposed to be a faithful citizen. So it requires some homework.
Yeah.
You have to know who are the candidates, what are their positions. We try as a diocese, we never tell anyone who to vote for.
Right.
But we do say, here are the positions. We try to make that research as easy as possible. But for our listeners, it takes time to say, let's make sure I know what are the issues and what is this candidate saying. And then we must act. I think it's very beautiful when I join people, and I know people do this, so many do this consistently, including our young people, praying outside of abortion clinics. We do so peacefully. We do so prayerfully. And yet it's difficult because those who are against us make it very intimidating and can be very rude and threatening. So I admire the courage of the people who do that. We need more people contacting our legislators, both state and federal level,
certainly,
on a regular basis, reminding them of their sacred duty to help children and their mothers. It's our sacred duty also.
And just to give a quick plug,
sure,
if I may,
sure.
The Virginia Catholic Conference has an action alert that you can participate in. It makes it very easy to contact your senator. So we're not asking you to research anything, but if you go to vacatholic.org, you'll see the link there to contact the two Virginia senators, neither of which supported the Born Alive Act remarkably. So if you want to let them know that of your disappointment in that, and that this bill should have been a bipartisan bill. We see all kinds of bills introduced where we know it's going to be a partisan fight. We expect that. This is not one where I think people were really expecting that.
Right.
They expected something different here. So if you would like to make your voice known, again, go to vacatholic.org, use that alert, but also consider signing up for the email list at the Virginia Catholic Conference so you see this stuff when it's coming beforehand. You can offer your voice. We reach people through social media that way, but that email list is really a critical way for you to be aware of what's happening so that you can act. We all should pray, but then that action is so critical.
Yeah, and as we've said numerous times on the podcast, is that we know for sure that every email, every phone call, every letter, they're counted.
Yeah.
And so that does make a difference. And, I think we're also making available in our social media and the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops some questions and answers, about this particular bill. And, some of those who voted in such a disappointing way or are trying to, give a rationale which is just not correct. And so we correctly have provided some of those clarifications.
Yeah, again, you can find those on our website, but also at vacatholic.org. Jeff Caruso and his team there, he's the executive director of the Virginia Catholic Conference, are doing a great job at keeping people informed. Bishop, the biggest story of this podcast, obviously, is earlier this month you released the names of all priests who have been credibly accused of sexual abuse of a minor in our diocese's history, stretching from 1974 to present day. Undoubtedly, this had to be a really difficult task, but it's one that you promised that you would do. Last year, you had said that you would do this year. Please share a bit of the process, how you came to this, and just personally, as our pastor, what was your reaction when we went through that?
Yeah, thank you, Billy. As a bishop, as a pastor, I would only want to bring good news to the faithful. Just as a father of a family, only wants to bring good news that will bring joy. I want the same for those in the Diocese of Arlington. But we know that, as in any family, there are times where bad news, sad news will surface, and we can't avoid it. And so it is in this case. Earlier this month, as you mentioned, I had to bring the bad news and explain the scope of sexual abuse of minors that has occurred and been found credible in our diocese since its founding in 1974. The day the list was announced, I was especially praying for victims and survivors. The pain they feel on a day like that must be, I can't imagine, but it certainly has to be particularly challenging. And not just for those who were abused by one of the names on the list, but for anyone who has been abused. That sad reminder, and I'm sure it brings back so many sad and horrific memories. So I continue to pray for them, and as I always say, I stand ready to meet personally with anyone who has been sexually abused as a minor and who would like to meet with me. We did announce, several months ago that this list would be coming as a sign of transparency, and we reviewed every file. It's like the third time we've gone through our files, this time with two former agents of the FBI, with everything given over to them. So this act of transparency was important, I think, not only to acknowledge the grave failures and sins of the past, but also to allow us to begin the healing that's necessary and to move forward. As a priest, it's very hard. I can't even imagine how anyone could hurt a child. You become a priest to help families, to shepherd the faithful, and the last thing you would want to do is to hurt someone. So to learn that one of my brothers, a brother priest, no matter how long ago it was, is my brother priest. We share that same fraternity, that same priesthood. Committed such an act is just unimaginable and hard to understand. From here, we have to come together as a family, even where there's bad news. We all know this within our own families. We have to come together. It's the only thing that will help us is to unite, to support, and to encourage one another, and so that's important. And I encourage anyone who wants to know more about how we report accusations of sexual abuse of minors, how we serve victims, how we screen staff and clergy, how seminarians are admitted to the seminary prior to them beginning. Please go to our website. We've spent a great deal of time trying to respond to the questions that we often hear and to answer and to go into detail with these issues. And many of the people who have done so have told me that it has been helpful. It's helpful for them to gain that knowledge. So I really do encourage our listeners to look at those resources.
So if you would like those resources, we've been publishing them over the last many months. You go to arlingtondiocese.org/child protection. There's a long frequently asked questions document there that really addresses a lot of very specific questions we've received. And there's other resources, including the list itself there. Bishop, you mentioned, as a priest, it's very hard to make an announcement like that. How are the priests responding that, currently active ministry? How, as you've talked to them, what has been their response?
Yeah, I think the same sentiments that I express as it's a brother priest. One of our brothers have done this. So there is that shame, that embarrassment, anger, really. And so the brothers share that. And, they share, they're human. And so they have to deal with the fact that, sometimes people will put you into a category and, look upon you with suspicion, even though you never have done anything, like that. And, it's hard to be lumped into that category. But we assure our faithful that all the priests in active ministry have never done that. But it brings us down, But then we have to remember all the brother priests who have served so faithfully and lovingly throughout these years, and know that's something that's part of our family also. But it is difficult, I would say, for our priests right now. I'm going to meet with all of our priests in March. Just to ask that very same question, to be honest with you. How are you doing in the midst of this? So we'll have that time, just me and my brother priest together, and have that time together, which I think will be important. Ask our faithful to pray for us.
Absolutely. You certainly have those prayers. And continuing on this general topic, the Holy Father just concluded a multi-day summit in Rome where he and the head of all the Episcopal conferences, so it's basically a bishop from each country representing the other bishops of that country, came from throughout the world to meet and discuss the issue of clergy sexual abuse of minors. In his closing statements, he outlined 8 guidelines that should be fostered in each respective country. Among those guidelines, he spoke about formation of seminarians and the virtue of chastity, recognizing the seriousness of abuse by clerics, a change in focus to thinking of protecting children first and the institution second, and accompanying those who have been abused. Bishop, you were observing what's going on in Rome like the rest of us and hearing these discussions and the statement from the Holy Father. What were your thoughts as it concluded?
Well, first of all, I was grateful to the Holy Father for bringing leaders from all the countries. Don't forget, this is a universal church that he has the pastoral care of, so he brought, and no country is the same in its experience and what it's dealing with. So the fact that he acknowledged that this is a universal problem and brought leaders of all the various countries together was such a positive step, and I'm grateful to the Holy Father for doing that. And for allowing the laity to play such a critical role in the summit, in the presentations, and offering perspectives as we go forward. The focus, as you mentioned, that the Holy Father stressed, is that protecting victims is fundamental to regaining the trust of the faithful in these issues, and we must continue to look forward. We must continue to assist them in their healing, even beyond what we're doing right now.
Right.
So one of the challenges that Pope Francis, I think, had going into this summit is that some countries have very advanced and time-tested policies and procedures. For example, we do in the United States.
Yeah, I was just going to say, we certainly do here.
Sure, since 2002. And other countries are now starting to see the full impact of sexual abuse by clergy and are looking for ways to prevent this from continuing. So he had quite a task in store.
It's a wide spectrum.
Everyone's at different places, and in many ways, to be able to acknowledge, how the Church of the United States has addressed this and has moved forward 17 years later is a good sign. And maybe we're in a position to help other countries to share with what we have learned and what has worked and what needs to be improved. And hopefully that we can do that so that we, God willing, can prevent any such abuse of children. No doubt, not only transparency was spoke about, but the accountability of bishops.
Yeah.
We have to admit, sadly, that prior to 2002, without having the charter that we now have and the norms and guidelines, bishops failed in their task to protect children, to report it as they should have, and that's a great embarrassment and shame in the life of our church. God willing, since 2002, as we move forward, God willing, that will never occur, as we move forward. And every bishop has that obligation. But to say that bishops have failed, as much as that pains me to say, it is a reality. And again, if we're going to move forward, we have to acknowledge it. We have to express our deep regret and sorrow and apologies. And the only way that we can bring any source of moving forward is by that acknowledgement and corrective steps, which I think the Holy Father is encouraging us to do. So in June, the bishops will meet again and consider more comprehensive policies and procedures, especially those related to bishops.
Yeah, those being bishops in the United States, right?
Yeah, right, yeah. And those who were not, those policies that were not fully developed when we initiated the charter. And this meeting will be extremely important. It's a follow-up to our November meeting, to the January retreat that we had together. And he does not want us to simply be in unity with the intent of preventing and reporting sexual abuse of children. He wants action and concrete steps. And we believe that, in union in communion with the Holy See, we will move forward with those policies and procedures.
Very good. Well, Bishop, know that we're praying for you and your
Thank
brother
you,
bishops
Billy.
as you go into that meeting. But just in general, we know that this is a tough time to lead, but your leadership is needed. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
So we have some questions from the faithful. The first one we have, Mary from All Saints in Manassas asks, why can't the church allow priests to marry and women to become priests?
Well, thank you, Mary, for that question. It's certainly a question that is asked frequently. But I don't want to make it a simple answer, because there are many theological responses to give, and we could certainly spend a whole podcast answering that question. But basically, the priest stands in the very person of Jesus Christ. Right? I absolve you from your sins. This is my body. This is my blood. He's ordained in persona Christi, we say, in the very person of Christ. Jesus, who came, the Son of God, came into our world, was fully divine, fully human, and as such, as human, came into the world with a gender, and that was male. And so the priest who stands in that person of Christ is male. That's the gender. And so the priesthood is one of the first things I also think is important to consider, is that the priesthood is at its heart a spiritual fatherhood. Right? That's why priest is called father. He brings about spiritual children through sacraments and preaching. Celibacy is not strictly a part of the sacrament of holy orders. We know that the church has ordained married men, but it does not allow ordained men to get married.
I remember the first time I heard that, because that's true for the diaconate as well.
Yeah.
Married men can become deacons, but if your wife was to pass away, for instance, of a deacon, for instance, you don't naturally just get to remarry.
That's
then.
right.
That was very interesting to hear that it works one way, but not the other for deacons. But for priests, obviously, they begin typically celibate. Yeah.
Right, and then celibacy is a sign of his spiritual fatherhood, in that he's totally devoted to his spiritual children, gives his whole life over to them. As I mentioned, Christ is the image of the Father, and he was celibate. It's fitting for priests to follow that example and accept. And it gives the freedom, to be totally devoted. Regarding women becoming priests, as I mentioned, the one reason I offer, but a key challenge is the spiritual fatherhood and the nature of the father. They call to be images, icons of fatherhood, and leaders of the spiritual family. But we know Jesus, as his church does today, gives women, the full respect, the dignity of her person, of her role in the church, and is called forward to exercise that motherhood and the many gifts that can be offered. It sounds simple in a way, but men aren't called to become nuns, right? Because that's the nature of the vocation, is rooted in spiritual motherhood.
That's true.
And so that's the point I'm trying to make, that this is a spiritual fatherhood.
All right. So we Herb from Holy Trinity in Gainesville, he said, I have read conflicting information regarding divorced Catholics who cannot receive communion. If the first marriage didn't take place in the church and the second marriage also didn't take place in the church, am I forbidden to take part in communion? Both of my wives, I would assume ex-wives, were non-Catholics, and my second wife is deceased. I have not been partaking of communion for the last 20 years and would like to resume. What would be your thoughts for him?
Sure, and thank you, Herb, for asking that question. But it's understandable, certainly, why there's some confusion for some Catholics regarding this issue, so I'm glad we're asking the question. If I understand it, Herb's circumstances correctly, it would seem that your marriage, Herb, with your first wife has ended, and your second wife is now deceased. I think that's
what he said.
So therefore, if you are currently not in a civil marriage and not living with someone as your spouse, there would be no canonical impediment to receive communion. However, since it's been 20 years, maybe I don't know all the circumstances here, so I would suggest, as I would to any of our listeners in this situation, of speaking with your local pastor, who will guide and assist you. It may be necessary, to do that. I would certainly recommend that, and to anyone who may be confused about whether they can receive communion, please speak to your pastor about that on the local situation.
I find it inspiring that, after 20 years, he wants to kind of re-enter the church in that way. Great? What a beautiful sign, and what a great witness of, the spiritual life of the church taking place in, instances you wouldn't necessarily think. So.
Yeah, that is wonderful. It really is.
Keep it up.
Yes,
great work.
Please.
So, Bishop, any final thoughts or any thoughts for the faithful, and if you would offer your final blessing as well?
Yeah, no. As I continue to say, as I visit our parishes and all, we understand that we continue to face some difficult and challenging times in our church, in our nation, and we discuss them today. But we are people of faith, and we must pray, Lord, increase our faith, that you are ever present, that you are near us, and that you will give us the strength and consolation and guidance that you need. He will respond. And I think the only thing he asks maybe in return is that we continue not to be divided, but to stay united and to support and encourage one another in that faith. So, dear listeners, if you would please promise that maybe we can continue to do so, to pray for and to continue to pray for one another. Know of my prayers for you and your families, especially as we soon will begin this sacred season of Lent. I pray that through your prayer and your fasting and almsgiving, it will be a time that you will draw closer to the Lord, be reconciled to Him, and deepen your relationship. So my prayers are with you, and together let us walk humbly with our God. Thank you for listening to the Walk Humbly podcast. Make sure you check out more episodes on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher. You can follow me on Twitter at Bishop Burbidge, where I offer spiritual reflections each morning in the gospel and share photos and updates of what is going on in the Diocese of Arlington. Stay up to date with news, event information, inspirational content, and more by subscribing to our e-newsletter at arlingtondiocese.org.